Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 264. Your energy is a precious currency, so use it wisely. Have you ever found yourself spending in an attempt to feel better or treat yourself? How long did that warm, satisfied feeling last? Did you feel guilty soon afterwards? I know I have sometimes. It's part of the instant gratification bug that takes hold when something is missing from our lives. And I have to admit to feeling relieved when I can return for a refund whatever it is I've bought. That's fine when we're talking about money spent on material goods or experiences, but that's not always possible in life. Now, I'm no financial guru, but I do have some sound advice that I'm prepared to share during this episode, as there's a resource we spend every day that cannot be refunded, compounded, or banked: our energy. As introverts, if we're recharged sufficiently well overnight, we tend to start the day with a pocket full of energy beans, and, unless we're careful, our interactions throughout the day gobble up our energy beans faster than a slot machine on the Las Vegas Strip. And the rub is, we're not even in with a chance of winning the jackpot. Extroverts, on the other hand, start the day beanless and get a payout whenever they're in a social interaction. That's why they need to chat so much, and who can blame them? What I've come to realise is that toxic workplaces and the bro brigade of ill-informed leaders don't realise our plight and think that being in their employ is the jackpot. They expect us to keep spending our energy beans willy-nilly, as epitomised by being dragged back into the office so that they can measure our presenteeism. Well, not this introvert. So as mentioned earlier, in this episode, through sharing hints and tips, I'll be encouraging you to become really mindful, but not miserly, about how you spend your precious energy beans. After all, we don't have the keys to the Bank of England or the secret password to Aladdin's cave, and we know the dangers of running an open tab that we can't pay off at the end of the day. More importantly, for we introverts, we can't afford to get into energetic debt, as the cost is astronomical and it's frankly reckless to expect us to. So, be mindful, but not miserly. There is a huge difference between being energy conscious in the way we live our lives as opposed to never wanting to spend a bean. In my financial life, I'm a saver and an investor with a long-term perspective. I want to be able to have some freedom in my golden years after all. However, unlike the currency of your realm, energy cannot really be successfully invested for a longer-term return or carried forward into a new day. It expires as our head hits the pillow or at the end of our day. But we can, and probably should, watch how we spend it or invest it in the short term. Those of us who have taken the time to understand our unique type of introversion will probably have become used to monitoring our social, emotional and energetic battery levels more closely than our phone batteries. This includes noting in whose company or the specific situations that drain those batteries the fastest. That's one of the ways we know how to manage our energy in the future. Squandering energy beans on the pointless hustle and grind so proudly paraded by the so-called heroic broligarchs will only lead to one thing for we introverts: burnout. The hints and tips that I'm going to share have typically emerged from my own journey, the work I'm doing, or the work I do with my clients. And I'm not here to judge, as only you know where you are in the situations in your life. So you can go to burnout if you want to or need to, but having plumbed those depths before, I have no intention of going back to burnout. I know the pressure to go there can be immense though. And I thoroughly recommend you use this episode as a catalyst to build your own prevention strategy. After all, prevention is always better than recovery. So you may be pondering what role living and working in a world that favours the extrovert ideal plays in the way we spend our energy beans. The great leaders are those who know us well enough to notice when we're struggling. If they have intentionally created a psychologically safe environment with us, we're more likely to feel able to say how we are and ask for what we need. Until a sufficient level of safety has been achieved and acknowledged, the manager, leader, or an emotionally intelligent colleague needs to ramp up their noticing. This is a common plea of mine, so you may be tired of hearing it, but I will never tire of saying it. When we all start to listen with our eyes as well as our ears, it's literally remarkable how much we can pick up. But all too often we're too busy wrapped up in our own world, minding our own business or our own energy, to be available to notice what's going on for others. There's rather too much glorification of long hours and expecting people to do whatever it takes to prove their commitment, for my liking. We've already seen the devaluing of proper thinking and dialogue, as evidenced in recent political fora, and now we're witnessing the catastrophic results. This has to stop, and it's time we called people out on their toxic behaviours and expectations, because what's going on is utter poppycock. So what do we want our leaders, managers and colleagues to notice and understand about us? We may be quiet and keep our heads down during working hours, but this is not because we're antisocial, stuck up, disengaged or lazy. It's because we do our best work and get into flow when our surroundings are quiet and we're not interrupted. When we ask for a meeting agenda ahead of time, it's not because we're being picky or scared of attending the meeting. It's because we are more likely to contribute our best ideas when we've had time to mull them over. This makes best use of our precious energy beans. Spontaneous meetings that interrupt our flow are a particular drain on our energy and they increase our stress levels. When we choose not to attend the after-work get-together, we're not being antisocial. For the sake of our energy, we're being selectively social. Most of us will have spent the day clinging on to whatever scrap of energy we can to make it to the end of the day intact. And unlike extroverts, socialising will not necessarily be fun for us. What is fun and necessary for we introverts is activating the power down chemical of acetylcholine, and that happens when we're able to quieten, focus inwardly and calmly reflect. So, if you rob me of all my energy beans during a busy day in an open plan office full of unstructured meetings and unfocused shallow conversations, I will break. Maybe not today, maybe not even tomorrow, but I will break. Now, what can we do to ensure we spend our beans wisely throughout the busy workday? I did promise I'd share some hints and tips after all. My mantra is that busyness is the delusion of the fool, focused productivity the preserve of the wise. It was necessary to create this mantra as too many of my clients were frustrated by their managers focusing on and measuring the wrong things. To use Cal Newport's phrase, they focus on the shallow work, the admin or non-cognitively demanding tasks that are easy to measure. And what's the saying? What gets measured gets done. Of course, this focus on shallow work comes at the expense of deep work, the the cognitively demanding tasks performed in a distraction-free environment that involve creativity, leading to mastery and increased productivity. When was the last time you were able to do uninterrupted deep work? And our so-called leaders and masters think it's better for us to be back in the office. Ridiculous. So here are some thought-provoking nudges with specific hints and tips. Number 1, let's redefine productivity. To the outside world, deep work often looks like not doing anything. We've stopped valuing thinking, as is evident in today's political landscape. As Newport says, if you don't define productivity, you'll default to busyness. What I find heartening is that if, as he says, deep work is about creating a meaningful and fulfilling life, it aligns beautifully with our decision to choose flourishing. And as introverts, we're pretty much hardwired for deep work. If we and our employers are going to benefit from this, we all need a mindset shift so we value thinking and time spent in flow, engaged in deep work. Thankfully, younger generations are already calling time on the unreasonable expectations of out-of-date management practice. It's true that many of those same managers are struggling and questioning the commitment of their young employees rather than questioning themselves. In truth, you don't need to be a genius to take a moment to ask yourself if management practices designed in the middle of the last century are still fit for purpose in 2025. So here's what I encourage you to do for yourself and those you manage if that's appropriate. Identify and define the real deep work that needs doing and set objectives around that, taking into account how you'll measure the work in terms of productivity. Number 2, boundaries show leadership, not weakness. As Tony Gaskin says, you teach people how to treat you by what you allow, what you stop, and what you reinforce. I know you've heard me say that before, and I'll keep saying it. Whether they like it or not, leaders are role models, as people do notice what they do. So when a leader applies and asserts a boundary, they're communicating to others that it's the right thing to do. I've noticed a rise in the popularity of the so-called boundaryless leader, claiming that's what's needed to mobilise the workforce, as it unshackles leaders from the hierarchical use of power and authority. So let me be clear, because there's a danger of misunderstanding here. When I'm talking of boundaries, I'm not talking of the use of hierarchical power. I'm talking about my personal boundaries and what I deem acceptable from others. And of course, my personal boundaries as an introvert will help me to protect my valuable energy beans. Continuing on the theme of boundaries, in some countries it's already law that people have a right to disconnect. It hasn't been enshrined in law here in the UK yet, but where it has been enacted, it includes things like the right of an employee to not have to routinely perform work outside their normal working hours, the right not to be penalised for refusing to attend to work matters outside of normal hours, and the duty to respect another person's right to disconnect, e.g. by not routinely emailing or calling outside normal working hours. The reality is, Gen Z and the first Gen Alphas are already demanding this, so we'd do well to recognise that it's time we all had a protected right to disconnect. Just imagine how that would help we introverts. I encourage you all to install, communicate and assertively uphold your own personal boundaries in order to model to others that this is how we show respect to each other. This starts with stopping the apologies that often precede us saying no. When we apologise for something that someone else has done, we're both giving away our power and using passive rather than assertive behaviour. Number 3, make workplaces energy inclusive. In my mind, inclusion is a business imperative, not a bestowed incentive. We don't create inclusive workplaces to satisfy the few, but to benefit the many. I know the current pressure to deny the value of DEIB, but as I've said before, when things get driven underground, they often become more powerful. The modern workplace, especially for STEM and professional services, needs to be a suitable place for knowledge workers doing deep work. Let's remember that around 50% of any population identifies as an introvert, so that's potentially half of every workforce struggling to do their best work in open plan offices that were designed in the early 1900s to mimic a factory floor. This is not what we need now, but the dinosaurs stuck in the efficiency thinking of the last century will struggle to believe that. Effectiveness is what's needed, somewhere where people can work effectively to meet appropriate productivity standards. For many of us, that would be a quiet pod or working from home, using collaboration tools mindfully. Too many of my clients struggle with the sheer number of communication channels, and that's before the banter and chatter around the desks. This is where the last point, number 2, rolls into this one, as we have to be able to ask for what we need and make a business case for it, especially if we have extroverted managers. This will serve to increase the psychological safety between us and our managers. Now, personally, I like to have cameras on when in video meetings, as I glean so much from people's facial expressions and body language. If that uses up too many of your energy beans, though, you need to be able to explain that, and here's why. It's quite possible for people who are overworked and being measured on the wrong thing to try to multitask when on a video call if they have their camera off. The result is that sadly neither is typically done well, despite the delusional optimism of the individual. Before you pull back in protestation, though, there is a case to be made for keeping a camera off in order to preserve energy beans and really focus on the content of the call. So my tip here is to be really mindful of where your energy beans are being spent wisely or squandered, so that you can be selective about where you'll spend them in the future. Of course, this applies both in the workplace but also in your social and/or family life. And remember that my brilliant battery boosters are a fantastic way to give yourself a top-up of energy throughout the day. I'll make sure the link is in the description for this episode. In conclusion, no one can deny your energy is your most precious currency, and if you don't spend it wisely, some manipulative scammer will spend your beans for you. And one thing I know for certain, they'll be off on their toes as quick as you like, and you'll never see those beans again. In this episode, I've provided 3 solid nudges around productivity, boundaries, and workplaces. There are things each of us as individuals can and maybe need to do in those 3 areas. It boils down to one thing, really. Be mindful rather than miserly about where you are spending your energy beans. They are precious, non-refundable, and can't be carried over. If, like me, doing deep work is what enables you to play to your strengths, drain the shallows and limit how much time you spend on the menial tasks. For those of you listening who are leaders, ask yourself if your 1950s management practices are still fit for purpose. Consider if you really know what your people need in order to be able to do the deep work that really adds value. And model your boundaries so your people know it's okay to protect their energy. You see, when we all mindfully manage our energy, we not only get the best from people, we all have the opportunity to flourish. So let me ask you this. If you were to do just one thing that would enable you to quit glorifying busyness and honour your energy as the precious currency that it is, what would that one thing be? Answers on a postcard, please, to quietly@flourishingintroverts.com. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.